Okay, everybody. So I'm going to make a couple of general comments just to help you make sense of some of this content, especially if this is some things that are new to you. And, this is really just to look at two tries, in a sense, that Americans do after the Revolutionary War. Throughout the fighting of the Revolutionary War, there's a great deal of collaboration. There's the Continental Congress. There had been like the Stamp Act, kind of grouping the committees of correspondence. You get these various spaces where colonists started to work together, and that becomes the framework really for the Articles of Confederation. Colonists arguably were very, very salty when it came to the role of the monarch. So after the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War, the idea of having a king or a leader that was going to have, great deal of power. The intent is to really, change the format. And of course, you have states that have a great deal of identity and political power. And after the Revolutionary War, there's an immediate kind of sense that that's where the political power will be, that each state will essentially operate, for all intents and purposes, almost like its own individual type of entity, maintain a great deal of its own decision making, but at the same time, the Articles of Confederation serve to enable some joint decisions, and the Articles are a loose confederation. There is essentially, one vote per state. There is a kind of delegation from each state that has one vote, and there is a really difficult, kind of strenuous process if there is a need to change the articles. It has to be unanimous. So there's a great deal of like focus on kind of making the articles basically a meeting time and place for delegates to gather together to make decisions maybe about war or whatnot. But very quickly, there does become some limitations of the articles. There is no kind of implementation system. Everything is really organized by kind of volunteering from the state. So when decisions are made, if there was, for example, going to be some sort of need for troops or something like that, the way that the articles work, states essentially would have to volunteer for that. And so states would have to put forth their particular troops. There really isn't a kind of process that operates outside of the states in a framework. And there's, a lack of enforcement, in other words, in this type of system. There's also a great deal of differences between some of the states, and so there are challenges that happen between the states, whether it has to do with trade, all kinds of things that exist where there are discrepancies about Western land, all kinds of things that maybe are issues between states, and who has access to what, and who gets to make decisions when states get into conflicts. There are those types of problems, and the articles have quite a bit of weaknesses in that regard. They're really organized as a kind of framework, almost like the United Nations is, a framework for there to be dialogue about what is collectively needed, but there's not really a lot of tools to create the things that are needed. And so you get the likes of somebody like a George Washington or Alexander Hamilton, who were very connected to the Revolutionary War, required a lot of assistance from Congress. And ultimately, the Continental Congress, we really don't get a great deal of support because they're really not quite the right tools for that. One of the big things that comes about is, and there are many things that like make it clear that the Articles of Confederation are weak, is Shays' Rebellion, and this is in the Hoda text, but Daniel Shays is a very kind of, he's a military person who had served in the Revolutionary War, feels like he hasn't really gotten his due, and there are issues that affect rural farmers in Massachusetts, and he takes it upon himself to really go against the government in Massachusetts. So this is a domestic issue. It's an issue that involves rural folks in Massachusetts who are seeking, something different from their local state government, but it gets violent, and there really isn't a kind of collective way to address this, and there becomes this fear amongst members of the, kind of the Continental Congress that this type of issue could get out of hand, and there could be a lot of rebellions, and rebellions that can't be affected by the central government. And so there's discussion to change the Articles of Confederation. And there was, the possibility that the Articles could have been maintained and given more teeth, and states kind of maintained a great deal of power. But we do have some Federalists, people who want greater centralized power. So in the American context, the United States context, we see federalism kind of labeling the group of people who want more centralization, whereas in South America, the Federalists are kind of people who want less centralization than the significant centralized people. There's like a different degree of scale there. But the Constitutional Convention that happens in Philadelphia, which is the outgrowth of a whole bunch of previous meetings and people who become really significant. We start to see talk of, kind of ditching the Articles of Confederation and creating a constitution. And of course, this is going to connect to these various compromises. And this is where we see it's not quite the same thing as like the liberals and the conservatives in South America, but we have, a general sense that there are polarized views around this question of how much centralization. You could take somebody like an Alexander Hamilton, who really wants a much more significantly centralized government, something that, not that he was favoring like a caudillo, so to speak, but he was leaning in the direction of order as a value, whereas, we see somebody like a Thomas Jefferson, for example, who's going to be somebody who maybe represents what comes to be called the anti-federalists, the people who kind of question, are we squelching those Enlightenment ideas and liberty if we move a little bit too far into the idea of one centralized power? So the various compromises, are really all about how much to diffuse and limit the power of something centralized, but still grant more centralized power than what the Articles of Confederation had. So what we see in the Constitution is implementation of a system that's going to actually enable the workings of the federal government. There will be a treasury, there will be a president, there will be these various branches of government. Some of this comes from the Enlightenment thinkers and whatnot, but you get debate at the Constitutional Convention, and then after the Constitutional Convention, and to this day, right, debates about the workings of the Constitution. Some of the bigger compromises, the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise is really all about the framework of the legislative branch. So the Great Compromise, between small states and large states, there's all of this sense about, whether large states are going to dominate because they're bigger and they have greater population, they'll have more delegates, and that's going to be a problem. But we get this kind of reasonable bicameral legislature where there will be two houses, our modern day House of Representatives, which is going to be based on population, and the Senate, which is going to be two, for every single state. So we get kind of representation that's a little bit more parity for small states, but also a space where every individual's vote or kind of interests matter to a certain extent. So, we end up with that Great Compromise, right? And that comes from, the debate between the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, and, Sherman from Connecticut, kind of comes up with this great compromise. And then how is it that that ultimately leads to the Three-Fifths Compromise, which is really about power in the legislative branch, and the power specifically of southern states that maintain slavery. So we get this question where, the Constitution has slavery as a topic all over it, without a doubt. Slavery, and even the slave trade, is so controversial. There is not an attempt to end the slave trade at the time of the writing of the Constitution, which is in the 1780s. It'll be ratified in 1787. The Constitution doesn't really, eradicate slavery in any sense. The one thing that we see is a fugitive slave, component to the Constitution, the ending of the slave trade in 20 years. So there's quite a few places where slavery is upheld in the Constitution. It's important to note that. The Three-Fifths Compromise is also one of those places where slavery is upheld, but it speaks to a compromise. In an effort to gain the Constitution, both sides kind of give in, and this shows a little bit of a north-south division. Southern states are interested in counting people who are enslaved for the purposes of population so that they have more delegates in the House of Representatives. And because enslaved persons are not, in the North, there is a fear in the North that you have slavery creating more power for the South. And of course, this will come to play in the U.S. Civil War, but we see the Three-Fifths Compromise, a way of including enslaved persons in the count, but not including them to the same degree, as others. And of course, the wording of this and the message in this speaks a lot to the way in which slavery became, very connected to the notion of property protection, in the Constitution. And later cases like the Dred Scott case or whatever will draw on these things. The Federalist Papers have to do with the writings of very persuasive essays. There's a typo in the Hoda text. These were anonymously printed under the pseudonym of Publius. These were, Alexander Hamilton and John Jay and James Madison, who basically created these short essays that would persuade Americans to be kind of supportive of the Constitution. And this was because in every single state, the Constitution had to be ratified. So every single state has its own debate in the state about whether or not to ratify the Constitution, and people largely take sides. And in the state of New York, there's particularly contentious debate, and in the state of New York is where we see the Federalist Papers get written. And they're very specific Federalist Papers, such as Federalist Paper number 10, right? Or various Federalist Papers where there's arguments. They are meant to be persuasive. They are one-sided, and they create arguments, for example, for why the Constitution is going to enable the protection of, the individual liberties, or offer protection for why there won't be, one leader that comes to default, or one extreme view, right? Federalist Paper number 10 addresses that, where Madison kind of suggests, because of the size of the country is so big and there's so many different ideas, we'll see a drowning out of those folks who are the extremists. And so there's all these different kinds of arguments, and the Federalist Papers arguably are fairly convincing, and we do see the Constitution, ratified. Okay, so I will just note a couple of, nope, we're not going to go to the War of 1812. We're in the Hoda book. Pay careful attention to the topics that are on this slide. There's spaces that you can take notes about. And then, the part that gets kind of creative thinking is, where can you make connections between the Latin American debate over centralization and federalism, and where can you kind of make some connections between the United States debate and the way in which the Constitution gets created and some of the specific limits on the Constitution, and then ultimately the Bill of Rights. It's very interesting because in Latin America, we do see some constitutions that have a great deal of mention of social equality and a lot of Enlightenment values, but they're not always upheld. And so, of course, they're not in American context